Welcome to the Cabot Theater. My name is Jen Gagne, and it's my pleasure to, like I said, welcome you to the theater tonight, to our community conversations, the first one of 2025, an important one about how to create healthy relationships and coercive behavior. So we're so thankful that you're here to join the conversation this evening. It's nice to see some friendly faces, and it's nice to see some new faces in the audience as well. Before we begin the program, I'm just going to give a quick little housekeeping. Community Conversations, first of all, is a program that's been going on for a couple of years now. We host it free, usually once a month. This month, we're doing it twice a month, so come back next week for our next one. It's an important dialogue. We like to open up to the community and share stories and share hot, important conversation topics that are meaningful to us in the community. And it's our pleasure here at the Cabot, as it's part of our mission, to open our doors to the community and have this experience together. So again, we really appreciate you being here this evening. I hope that you'll go on our website, visit and see some of the other community conversations we have coming up. They're, like I said, monthly, and they're always free. Some of the other housekeeping this evening, if you'll notice emergency exits, there are 2 located downstairs in the orchestra. We don't have anyone in the balcony tonight, so no worries there. And everything that you've picked up at concessions this evening is compostable. So that includes your popcorn, your candy wrappers, your drinks, cups, straws. There are receptacles in the back of the theater as well as the lobby, so we appreciate you helping us do our part for the environment and get those in the right receptacles on your way out. So before I introduce our keynote speaker, District Attorney Paul Tucker, I'd like to share a little bit about my own personal story and experience with the topic this evening. When I was in my early 30s, this was about just over 15-ish years ago, I was living in the city. I had a wonderful career. I had a great group of friends. I come from a very close family. I was raised by parents that taught me to have self-worth, and I have a very strong sense of self. I would call myself a feminist. And yet, I found myself in an abusive relationship. I began dating somebody, and it started off all rosy and wonderful, as most relationships do. It was fast and furious, lots of feelings going around, as all relationships, no matter what age you have them. Lots of feelings going around. These were more intense feelings that I experienced from my boyfriend at the time, what we now call love bombing. There was not a term, I think, back then when I was going through it. It was probably 2 years after I had this experience that I read about it, and it hit me over the head, and I went, wow, that's exactly what happened. It was a complete and utter, quick-moving, I love you, but not really knowing me that well, because we're all new in relationships. We don't really know everything about each other right away, and wanting to spend all his time with me. So slowly, I began to retreat from my friends and my relationships, as he explained, we should just hang out together more and more. We don't really need to hang out with your friends. Why don't we just hang out, just the 2 of us? So, flag. But I made excuses in my head, and I kind of put it away. And I said, oh, that's just me. I'm over-worrying. That's not a big deal. As we do, as we all do, right? As humans, we make excuses in our minds to make things work for things we really, really want. Then I began to get comments, little comments here and there about my appearance, or again about who I chose as friends, or if that person was really a good friend, and what his thoughts were about that. Small little comments. I think the expression is death by a thousand cuts. That's pretty much what it felt like towards the end. Through the experience of going through the little comments and the manipulative behavior that began to happen, I felt it in my gut. I was like, you know what? This doesn't feel right when those comments came out. But again, more excuses in my head. And then I changed my behavior. I started to lie to myself about what was right and what felt wrong. I lied to my friends because, oh, we're not going to come out tonight. He's tired. I'm tired. We have plans. Sometimes I lied to him because I wanted to see my friends, but I didn't want to deal with the aggravation and the arguments and the emotional subterfuge that would happen from it, either before or after. I continued the relationship and we moved in. And the very first night that we moved in together, the verbal and emotional abuse began. Although I guess you could say the emotional abuse had already started to happen already. And that's the thing about these relationships and this behavior. It's insidious. It's small things that create a big problem. So when the behavior escalated to verbal and emotional abuse, I continued to make excuses in my head. Because at this point, I felt ashamed. I felt ashamed that I let it happen. I felt ashamed I couldn't fix him. I felt ashamed that I was a smart woman and I found myself in a bad relationship. But I didn't want to acknowledge it, and I didn't share it with anyone. I didn't share it because it really wasn't in the culture at that time. We weren't talking about it as much. It was still pretty quiet. And also, I was isolated. So no one saw the signs. And again, the shame, I didn't know where to start to even tell somebody. Eventually, it escalated to worse behavior. I'd like to say that I walked away or got out when that happened, but I didn't, for those same reasons. I was ashamed. I felt like I could do something to fix it. I felt like maybe it was my fault. These are the things that you start to tell yourself in these types of relationships. It's my fault. Maybe I did something. You're right. I looked at somebody the wrong way. I shouldn't have done that. And you become smaller. And I saw all the things happening to myself. I saw myself turning into somebody I didn't recognize. I saw my light dimming. I saw all the changes, and I couldn't get out. I couldn't get my way out. I couldn't find my way out. Eventually, I remember the turning point was I was trying to reconcile in my own head why I did not need to be best friends or good friends or keep a relationship going with one of my dearest and oldest friends to this day. I remember thinking to myself, I don't need to talk to her anymore. It's probably not a big deal. I don't need the friendship. It's okay, because he had manipulated and coerced me into thinking, maybe this person isn't as an important person in your life. You don't need her. You don't need her. Because again, the work to isolate, and this one person was still hanging in my life and in my stratosphere, and he was trying to finish that tie, get rid of that tie so that I could safely stay with him and he could act whatever way he did. And I realized I can't do this. And I just broke. And that was eventually where I realized, or came to the moment where I just said I had had enough. So I got out. And it was not easy, and I was lucky to be able to do it. I did it by myself. And after, when I shared my experience with my family and with my friends, they were shocked. They had no idea. They knew I wasn't myself. They knew they didn't really like him, but they weren't really around him because he had isolated us. And they didn't really see all the signs because also it wasn't, again, in our culture. We weren't talking about it the way we talk about it now. Why this is so important that we're having this kind of conversation today. I remember my family feeling so badly that they couldn't help me, that they didn't know, and it wasn't their fault. They didn't have anything to reflect on. They had no information out there to remind them, hey, if you notice something like this goes on in relationships, be aware. That's why I wanted to share this story with you tonight. It is so important for our young people who are starting out relationships and forming what a good, healthy relationship is, to understand what that looks like and to listen to your gut and to know that there are people around you that are there to help you if you ever are to find yourself in a situation like that, or to witness or see behaviors like we're going to talk about at the panelists and with our keynote speaker and Senator Lovely this evening about this important legislation that's been put in place for these reasons, so that people are not afraid to talk about it, and to pay attention to signs in your own relationship, because it can happen at any time. Like I said, I had also had many healthy relationships before that one, so it happens. It can happen at any time, and it's so, so valuable to have people in our lives to look out for us, to make sure that this doesn't happen to them and to ourselves. I'd also like to just add, my husband wanted me to share this. I am in a healthy, wonderful relationship now, because he comes here a lot and he was like, please make sure they know. I am in a wonderful relationship with a lovely, very busy family now. And it's given me moments of a reflection to remind myself of what a good relationship looks like and what our gut tells us is a bad relationship and bad signs. And it's so important. So thank you for letting me share that this evening. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Essex District Attorney Paul Tucker.
Good evening, everybody. So we hear a lot about what we call lived experience, and it's instructive on so many levels. And what you just heard is a lot more powerful than any words that I could offer when I talk about the law and some of the landscape about what we see around domestic violence, but it really is hearing firsthand. And I know many of the folks that are engaged in this work. I know Sarah Stanley's here. You'll hear from her. Senator Lovely doing the legislative work. When you hear from these folks, you're going to hear some very caring people, but that's what it's all about, trying to get people into a better and safe space. So I view my job today as hoping to accomplish a few things. One is to offer a welcome, which it's very honored. I'm very honored to be here to take part in this community conversation. Secondly, to say thank you. Say thank you for folks who come out on a cold January night to engage in what I think will be a great dialogue and talk about important things and bring something back with you when you leave here tonight. Bring something into your life that's going to help somebody tomorrow and going forward. Third, I'd like to offer my perspective during, and I'll use my career in the police department in Salem as a backdrop, because it almost exactly coincides with what I think is the biggest changes in domestic violence answers by law enforcement from almost my first days on the police department right up until some of this legislation that I had the privilege to work on as a state rep before I became district attorney. And at the end, to leave with some appreciation for the folks who are working in this space, for our law enforcement partners, for our legislative partners. So that's my mission for this evening. So I'd like to start off by giving about 42 years worth of history in just a few minutes. So I started on the police department in February of 1983 in Salem. And when it came to what we now know as domestic violence, which we now know is a crime, back then was often thought of people in law enforcement and people in the community as a family issue. Was a family problem. And oftentimes, I can tell you, as a very young patrolman, going to houses where there was a, quote, family issue, it in fact was domestic violence. And we know that now through the lens of a rearview mirror, but we didn't know it at the time. So in 1983, picture a young patrolman going to a house where an assault has taken place between intimate partners, and there has been an injury. But because a weapon was not used, it was simply a fist or a push, we did not have the right of arrest at that time. Think about the frustration of a young police officer knowing that an abuser was in the house and would stay in that house, because oftentimes it was the victim of that assault that we would have to move either back to the police department, try to find a relative that they could stay with, or some type of emergency shelter, of which there was very little back then. Think about the frustration when all we could do in that case was to file for a summons, which is literally a postcard in the mail that generally took about 4 to 6 weeks to be delivered to the house to have the abuser appear in court. And much more often than not, nothing would happen. There'd be no accounting for what this person did, no accounting, no punishment for the behavior. And as we all know, that cycle of violence would continue. Fortunately, right around 1985, 1986, I call it a reckoning, an enlightening. There was finally some reasoning that we needed to do something. And unfortunately, it took some really terrible cases to get the attention of people who could actually do something about it. It took some awful violent cases. And finally, in Massachusetts, we moved forward. So from mid-1980s, we made a steady progress right up until 2018 and 2020 with some of the legislation that I'm going to talk about. It gave police officers the right of arrest if there was any type of an assault. It put a stronger 209A restraining order in place with many boxes to check to see what was appropriate for that dynamic that was happening in the house. And it also finally had a reckoning in the judiciary for judges to understand and begin to understand in the 80s, and now I think do a good job of understanding this cycle of violence and what these folks were facing. In September of 2024, an act to prevent abuse and exploitation became what I call the most significant changes in the Massachusetts law in, I'll say, almost 40 years. And that's why I use as bookends my career in law enforcement, because I saw it at the beginning, and now I've seen it where we're finally at a place where we finally should be. So what I'd like to do is I'm just going to go through a brief set of topics, and I'll tell you a little bit about each one. So in part of that piece of legislation, there's some things in there that while some folks may not think, well, that's not exactly on point for domestic violence, it really is closely related enough, because we're going to see when we get to the terms of coercive control, what I'm going to mention that's in that legislation is part of it. How we treat juveniles who get involved in something called sexting. It's sending pictures, and we've seen such an increase in this that we knew that something had to happen. More on that in a minute. The definition of abuse. I'm going to give you the definition of abuse, which is updated to reflect really modern times. The statute of criminal harassment. And then another interesting thing is the increase of the statute of limitations for certain offenses around domestic violence. Now, the statute of limitations is it's a time limit on how soon a case has to be brought. And in many cases, because of lots of reasons, particularly when it comes to domestic violence and sexual assault, these cases, particularly survivors of these terrible crimes, are not ready, and sometimes it takes years and sometimes decades before they are ready to come to law enforcement. So my hat's off to the legislature as well for addressing the statute of limitations and giving law enforcement and victims and survivors more time to actually bring their case forward. So when it comes to the sexting with the juveniles, one of the biggest points that I'd like to make is that although we need to address this behavior, we certainly do, because it can be very destructive, particularly among young people. If these images get out, people become the target of bullying and just some awful, awful things that are happening to them. But there's a balance here. It can't be all about punishment. There has to be a balance where we're looking to make sure we hold people accountable, but also because most of these behaviors deal with juveniles. And we've had a realization that the longer that we can keep young people out of the system, out of the court system, out of the incarceration system, here's what we know. We know that exponentially, the longer we keep some of these kids out of the system, the older that we can get before they take any charges, much, much more chances for opportunities and staying out of the system. We also know the inverse is true as well, that if somebody ends up charged with a crime and they go into the juvenile system, we know that their chances of recidivating are much, much higher. We also know that criminal records follow people when it comes to school, military, housing, job opportunities. So we really do need to balance public safety and looking out for the best interest of these young folks, and also looking forward to making sure that we leave opportunities open for them as well. The idea behind the legislation was more rehabilitative than punitive. And one of the things that I'm very proud of the work that my office does at the Essex County DA's office is the work that we do around juvenile diversion. We have a very robust program, and although sometimes folks think it's just a slap on the wrist, that it's really people are getting away with things, it's a real program. It's things that they have to complete, and if these young people who we give this opportunity to, if they don't complete it, we can bring those delinquency charges back, and unfortunately sometimes we have to do that. We've also started and really ramped up a really good program that we call restorative justice. We hired a full-time restorative justice coordinator. That's repairing the damage that people have done to one another. Now, it's not appropriate for every type of crime, but when used judiciously, used in the right circumstances, we're getting offenders together with people who have been harmed, and there's something magic that happens, and we've had some pretty good success with that as well. Now, the legislation also expanded the definition of abuse under 209A to include something called coercive control, and I think that's going to be a big part of what the discussion is around this evening. Now, let me just say that legislation, particularly big legislation that changes things, takes a little bit of time to take hold. And I think that's going to be the case with some of these new legislation. I'm going to talk in a couple of minutes about some of the legal challenges that we're going to see. Change is hard. Change is hard for people. Change is hard for law enforcement. Change is hard, frankly, for defense attorneys who are representing their clients. And the definition of the coercive control, and I think this is important for the rest of tonight's discussion, it's a pattern of behavior intended to control, intimidate, or isolate a family member or household member. Example, monitoring communications, threatening harm. I'm going to give you a couple other examples, some of the things that we see. But the key here is we look for patterns of behavior, things that cause family members to reasonably, I'm going to underline reasonably, a fear of physical harm or have a reduced sense of physical safety. Now, we're going to see the word reasonable several times. One of the difficulties in crafting legislation, it's not a one-size-fits-all, and it's really difficult to get it right. And one of the things that we're going to see as we go through not only this evening's presentation, but also how this law is going to play out in real life in the courts, and that is how we interpret terms. Sometimes people can look at the same word and have different interpretations. Certainly, we have our interpretation as prosecutors. The defense attorney may have theirs. Judges are looking at that. People bring their lived experiences to these jobs. And oftentimes, the frame of reference that people have, and I'll talk specifically about judges, some of the judges, we have terrific judges in Massachusetts. This is not a criticism. This is just human nature. And sometimes when we craft legislation, we do it the best way we can so we have the true meaning of words. But that can be very difficult. Think about some of the words that's involved in this legislation: autonomy, isolation, deprivation of basic needs, controlling finances, damaging property, threatening to publish sensitive personal information or photographs, including sexually explicit images, abuse to a family animal. Now, I mention these because one of the things that experts in this field know, and the experiences I had as a longtime detective in Salem, I served on what we called the lethality assessment team at the Essex DA's office. I was a captain in the police department at the time. And Mary Alice Doyle, who's now our first assistant, she was actually the head of this team. And what we would do is we would meet every month, and we had a rubric. It was 10 or 12 different boxes, literally boxes to check. And it's the things that we look to see what's happening in the dynamics of these domestic violence situations. And we would try to look at what we consider to be the worst 10 or 12 most dangerous situations. And the more of these boxes that we checked with this lethality assessment, the more danger we thought the victims were in. And we were proactive about this, to reach out and see whatever we could do to make that person safe. And all of these things, that list that I just mentioned, these were all part of that rubric. You know, when we talk about somebody that puts their hands on the throat of their intimate partner, that's one of the top things that we worry about. abuse to an animal, abuse to a child in the home that is not the biological child of the abuser. These are things that add to that rubric and cause us a lot of worry. So some of the things that we're going to have difficulty with is to discuss in court the meaning of these words. The best example that I can give you, some experience that we had, was when we put a stalking statute in. Now, if I asked any one of the crowd that we have here, a number of folks that we ask, what's your definition of stalking? I think we get the basics down, but then we might not agree on what's stalking and what's not. And I could give you 15 different scenarios. Somebody asks another person out on a date, they say no. They send flowers, they start to talk, they start to call, they start to send letters, they start to show up at the house. When does it go beyond what we would consider to be appropriate relationship or stalking? And frankly, the judicial system had a lot of difficulty with this, to the point where the original stalking statute had to be pulled back and reworked again to try to put some guardrails in place to make sure that we all pretty much agreed on what that definition was. There's a struggle, I foresee a struggle with this, with the coercive control language. There's some serious punishments in effect. Jail terms, sometimes between 2.5 up to 5 years, between $5,000 and $10,000 fine. There's some teeth in this law. So I think that's a good thing moving forward. I do think some of the difficulties that we're going to have, and I'll just mention a couple. One is, I worry about retaliation, the abuser using these very terms and this very law to try to turn the tables on the victim. I do worry about that. I worry about making sure that the judicial system understands the dynamics of the cycle of violence, to understand how this happens. I think you heard a few things about that with the previous speaker. Taking a look at words like autonomy, unwarranted. Some of these terms are going to need some scrutiny, I think, to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. I do want to mention just for a minute about the extension of the statute of limitations. I think that's critically important. One of the things that has been very frustrating to me as a detective was when we found out somebody was responsible for a crime, or we tried to charge somebody for a crime, and we realized that the statute of limitations had run out. We know who did it, we can prove it, but we were barred because of this statute. I understand the reason for it. It's difficult to bring cases that are very old, and the law understands that. But one of the breakthroughs that we have had is increasing the statute of limitations, particularly when it comes to sexual assault and domestic violence. People are not always ready. Sometimes it takes a long time of therapy, understanding, family support. All of these things take time, and once in a while the duration of that would run out. So again, I want to commend the legislature for doing a very good job with that as well. Criminal harassment, that's been updated. I know former Governor Baker did a lot of work on this. It took a lot to get through the legislature. Let me just give you a 30-second timeout on how legislation works, and my former legislative colleague, Senator Lovely, knows this better than anybody. Oftentimes, it takes a long duration to get it right. And I think in Massachusetts, one of the things that I think we can be proud of is, although legislation sometimes takes a while, we generally get it right, and it doesn't have to go back and be fixed. And that's the case, I think, with many of these statutes. It took a long time, but I think they were very thoughtfully done. We heard from all sides, from prosecutors, from defense, from advocates. In our office, we have a really talented group of victim witness advocates who do incredible work in the courts of the Commonwealth every day. So I think that the product of the legislation here, I think, is going to be effective. I know when we take a look at what we call the reasonable person standard, and that's what we're going to fall on. That's what we're going to look back to. You know, I used to joke, I taught for a long time at some local colleges, and I used to ask my students, and they'd kind of give me a funny look. I would talk about all these things, and I'd say, this is the reasonable person standard. Who is that reasonable person? They all kind of look at each other like, do you know what a reasonable person? It's the collective reasonable person. It's what society wants to see. And that's going to be the standard that we're going to have moving forward. Let me take a minute to offer my appreciation for our victim witness folks. for our DV advocate, Sarah Steenley is here from HAWC. It is not overstating it to say that these folks are doing life-saving work. It is life-saving work what they're doing. Up in Merrimack Valley, some of the agencies up there, these are things that don't always get the headlines. They don't lead on the TV. These are the things that are happening behind the scenes. We've got so many dedicated volunteers, people who are doing this because they're just trying to help, trying to make a difference, and it's phenomenal. I want to thank our law enforcement partners. I know in Salem, it was baby steps as we moved to create a standalone domestic violence unit. We took a look in Salem under Bob St. Pierre, who was chief before me, and we took a look at some metrics. And one of them was the amount of restraining orders that were applied for Salem residents in Salem Court. And when we took a look at that number, it was staggering. Over 500 the first time we looked at it. And that really began the conversation of looking for some grants to do some training, to having a full-time domestic violence officer. Now, Max Zarin holds that role in Salem now. Beverly PD has done incredible work in this area. Ross Steinborn, who put this together, is working full-time in Beverly in this entire area. This was unheard of not that long ago. So congratulations to everybody who's doing this work. The folks that are here from my office, I just want to say thank you. Sharon Lubis is my chief of staff. Mike Keith Feldman is our chief of communications, both here tonight. And I'll tell you, I've only had this job now for 2 years as district attorney. The dedication and the work that the folks in my office, and I think it's replicated across the Commonwealth, is nothing less than amazing. We've had some really, really difficult cases. I've had this job 2 years. I'm halfway through my first term. We've had some difficult cases that you've read about in the paper. Domestic violence, sometimes the intersection of domestic violence and mental health with some terrible outcomes. We've also done some really, really good things as well. And one of the things that we're very proud of is the work that we do, not only all year, but in October during Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We do, my office, we sponsor a roundtable. We have a guest speaker, and the speakers the last couple of years, they'll make you laugh, they'll make you cry, they'll make you think. But what you know is they are telling you firsthand the journey that they went through, and they are truly, they may have been victims early, they are truly survivors, and it's so inspirational. I know I feel the exact same way when we go to the HAWC walk every summer, and it's at the Salem Common, and when the speakers get up there, you can hear a pin drop, because this is real life. These are people's journeys, these are their lives, and to think about what they've gone through and the courage to stand up in front of hundreds of strangers, it's awe-inspiring. So thank you all for what you do. And another great privilege that I have this evening is to introduce Senator Joan Lovely. Joan is somebody that I worked with at the State House for my 8 years as a rep. Joan is in the top leadership position in the Senate. And if I've said this once, I'll say it 100 times and 100 times more. Nobody cares more deeply for constituents, for people, for victims of crime, for people who have suffered not only sexual abuse, but physical abuse. She's somebody that walks the walk, and she shows up. And doesn't just show up, she does the work. And again, not surprised that she's here because she's everywhere. It's an honor to introduce my friend, Senator Joan Lovely. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Paul. Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be here this evening with all of you in this really special space. This space goes back to my childhood because I'm a Beverly native. So it's always wonderful to be here. Thank you to the Cabot for sharing this space, for hosting these community conversations. They're so important. And Paul, thank you. I just want to say it was an honor to serve with Rep. Tucker at the time, Rep. Chief Tucker, they used to call for the 8 years. We did some great work together, but Paul, what you brought into the House of Representatives, to the legislature, with your policing background all the way to chief, on police reform, on criminal justice reform. Now, actually, you are we partner on these bills as they're going forward and new laws that are going into place. I just so appreciate you, and we are so lucky to have you as our district attorney. So thank you. So I did want to thank you again for the opportunity to speak tonight and highlight the importance of addressing domestic violence in our communities. It's something there are far too many victims every single day, and we hear from them. I get phone calls all the time. I just heard from a mom yesterday, and I'll talk about her in a moment. But I want to give you a few statistics. A CDC survey found that nearly half of the women in the United States, half, have experienced sexual violence, physical violence, or stalking from an intimate partner in their lifetime. Half. 3/4 of female victims reported that they were first victimized before the age of 25. Massachusetts has one of the lowest percentages of women reporting domestic violence in the nation, with about 36% of women who have been victims, due in part by efforts in the legislature to address domestic violence in all its forms. A report from the State Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team last month found 26,463 domestic violence incidents reported to law enforcement in 2023 alone in our state. Several domestic violence-related crimes like murder and non-negligent manslaughter, aggravated assault, simple assault, and intimidation were all down in 2023, a testament to the work that the policymakers, our law enforcement, our district attorneys, our advocates have continued to do to curb DV incidents. And Representative Tucker, DA Tucker, sorry, I'll never be able to forget Representative Tucker. District Attorney Tucker talked about the law that we just put into place in 2024. I was a proud co-sponsor, worked with all of my colleagues to advance this bill to law. And the law, it bans the distribution of revenge porn and deep fakes. That's what really started the impetus for this law, was revenge porn. We heard it over and over from so many victims, and there was nothing that could be done. So it bans the distribution of revenge porn and deep fakes while also expanding protections against abuse and exploitation. It modernizes our laws so that they can reflect the types of abuse that exist today in the digital age. And as DA Tucker spoke about, it includes coercive control, which I think is worth repeating, a pattern of behavior intended to threaten, intimidate, harass, isolate, control, and coerce or compel compliance of a family or a household member that causes fear, a reduced sense of physical safety, or autonomy. So I just want to share two stories. While we were doing this bill last year, actually it was in the prior session as well, had a constituent come to me. She was divorced, and her husband, ex-husband, was conducting coercive control by dragging her into court month after month, year after year, filing different types of complaints for modification, complaints against her, and having to, again, hire an attorney. I'm an attorney. When I did practice law, I'm a full-time legislator, but when I was practicing, I practiced in the probate and family court, divorce and custody, mostly custody issues. So I understood what she was telling me. And she said, I'm just about broke, having to go in time after time after time and defend myself. And he was using the courts to control her, and using the courts to control her and her wallet. And so we used that as an example. Now let me fast forward to just Monday night. Monday night, I'm at a meeting at the senior center, and a friend who I know came to me and said, I just got a text from someone who's very concerned about a homeless mother with 3 children living in a motel in Danvers, and she has no place to go, and she's desperate for help. I said, well, Danvers, that's my district. Have her, she didn't have her name. I said, if I could learn who she is, we'll reach out. So the next morning, we were able to reach out to her. And she told her story of how she became homeless. She was married. It was a very difficult divorce, a lot of coercive control by her ex-husband, who was also bringing her into court over and over. Now she's homeless. They had 2 evictions on their records, so very difficult to rent, to find a landlord to rent to you with an eviction record. But he had the same eviction record, but he was using that in the court to say, I should have custody of the kids. She has an eviction record. He was living in another household, so he didn't have an issue of being homeless. So we're going to help her, and we're actually going to refer her to HAWC. Sarah, wherever you are, thank you. Sarah Stanley and the HAWC team and the amazing work that you do to protect victims every day, protect and support. So this law that Rep. Tucker, DA Tucker, I'm sorry, I'm always going to do that, District Attorney Tucker talked about, that is now law, about including coercive control, is just so necessary, and we did that, listening to people's stories. I also want to say thank you to Jen for sharing her story. It's very difficult to share personal stories, especially in public, but it's so important because it reminds me of I was sexually abused as a child, so one of my biggest policy areas is child sexual abuse prevention. This is another big policy area for me, for young adults who maybe find themselves in this situation of domestic violence and coercive control. So again, thank you to the advocates, to HAWC, thank you to Jen for sharing, thank you to law enforcement, thank you to Ross, the Beverly Police Department, all the police departments. You work so hard to be able to make sure that you're responding when people are in the most need. And thank you to all of you for being here this evening, and I look forward to listening to the panel and learning more aside all of you. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this important discussion on coercive control and building healthy relationships. My name is Ross Steinborn, and I'm a domestic violence advocate at the Beverly Police Department. I've been mentioned a few times. I want you to know I'm not a police officer. I'm a civilian advocate, and it's kind of a neat position that doesn't happen in a lot of police departments, so it is kind of cool that Beverly's doing that. I'm honored to be your moderator for today's session. As DA Tucker, Senator Lovely, and Jen, our survivor speaker, have already mentioned, Massachusetts has recently passed legislation that redefines abuse in the state, shifting away from a traditional violent incident model to a coercive control model. I lost my place already. This legislative change marks a monumental step forward in how we understand and address intimate partner abuse. For years, domestic violence laws have primarily focused on physical violence, hitting, slapping, and other visible incidents of harm. While these acts are undeniably harmful, the violent incident model fails to capture the full range of abusive behaviors many survivors experience more subtle, insidious forms of control, such as psychological manipulation, emotional abuse, and isolation and financial domination. Behaviors that may not leave visible marks, but have lasting and profound impact. The coercive control model, now recognized in Massachusetts law, acknowledges these behaviors as forms of abuse. It focuses on the ongoing patterns of coercion and manipulation that keep individuals trapped in abusive relationships, often without physical evidence. This broader understanding of abuse is key to providing better support and protection for victims and for creating healthy relationships. Today, we're privileged to have a distinguished group of panelists who will help us explore these new legislative definitions, the real-world implications of coercive control, and how we can work together to foster relationships based on equality, trust, and respect. First, we have Sarah Stanley. She is Executive Director of Healing Abuse Working for Change, or HAWC, a nonprofit dedicated to serving survivors of domestic abuse. With a strong background in law and social justice, Sarah has worked in both private practice and legal aid, empowering marginalized communities. Since joining HAWC in 2015, she has led the organization in its mission to provide and expand critical services across 23 cities and towns. A committed advocate for survivors, Sarah also serves on various boards and committees, furthering her impact in the field of social justice. And alongside her is ADA Hunter Mello, who is a seasoned prosecutor and domestic violence supervisor at the Salem District Court for the Essex County District Attorney's Office. We actually just heard her boss speak recently. With a background in history and political science, Hunter earned her law degree from Suffolk University and has a wealth of experience from her time at the Manhattan DA's office, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. In her current role, she leads the domestic violence unit at Salem District Court, overseeing the prosecution of a wide range of cases with a focus on domestic violence. Hunter's work is deeply rooted in advocacy for victims and for advocating justice in her community. Could we welcome our panelists, please? Thank you. Our conversation today will not only unpack the significance of this legislative shift, but also discuss how we can support survivors, educate communities, and work towards a future where all relationships are built on equality, trust, and respect. At the end of our discussion, we'll open the floor to questions, so please be thinking about anything that you'd like to ask or reflect upon during the conversation. Thank you again for being here. This is, of course, a difficult but crucial conversation, and I'm excited to dive in with our panelists. So we'll get started. Here are the questions. So, Sarah, I'd like to start with you. HAWC has, I've been working with HAWC for a long time in the field, and I know already that HAWC's been very involved in thinking through how this coercive control law will work at the ground level. From your experience and your team's experience, how do you see this shift in law affecting the way services are delivered to survivors, and how might we better support them through these often invisible forms of abuse?
Thanks so much, Ross. Welcome, everybody. It's so nice to be here in community with you. This expansion of the definition of abuse in the 209A law is an important recognition of what we know people were experiencing. So previously, the 209A law was so narrow that it only provided protection for a very small sliver of people experiencing abuse. Because that definition of abuse has been expanded by adding particular behaviors, including the patterns of behavior included in coercive control, that tool of the 209A restraining order is now available to a wider range of folks. So previously, where we were only able to use that tool for a sliver of the people that came to us for help, now this tool is going to be available to so many more people. And so that's a really important difference right out of the gates.
Great. And just to kind of go along with that too, so right before this law took effect, I had a client who wanted to get a restraining order because her partner had essentially said, if you leave me, I'll commit suicide. And so she went to get the restraining order, and on the 10 day, the two-party hearing, it was denied because that, and now with this new law, that is something that would be taken into consideration more thoroughly, I believe.
And so that was alluded to by DA Tucker previously, but an important change in the law where previously it was tied directly to fear of imminent physical harm. Now it's been broadened to include fear for their physical safety and autonomy. That is a really huge expansion of the types of behavior that will fit in and qualify someone for a 209A, and we'll talk a lot more about what that means. But I know, for example, I'm also an attorney by trade. Earlier in my career, I worked with a client whose partner was so controlling of what she ate. She was the most petite, small thing you've ever seen. He would count the boxes of food in the pantry. He would count the cans, and she wasn't allowed to access the food. She was a very successful professional at a bank. But she was reduced to sneaking food out of her trash can when her partner wasn't around. And that behavior did not qualify for a restraining order at that time. And her experience has always stayed with me of kind of the real horror people experience that is not just physical violence. We've been preaching for years that abuse is more than physical violence, and now this tool of a restraining order reflects that reality.
And to take a quick step back, would you mind explaining a little bit for folks maybe who aren't on the same page of like the process of a restraining order a little bit?
Sure. Well, my amazing HAWC team who's here, shout out to everyone. Our team is available in 5 local courts, and they can help people when you go to apply for an abuse restraining order, more formally known as an abuse prevention order. You need to fill out some kind of personal information forms and an affidavit stating what has happened previously to cause you fear of imminent physical harm, and now fear of physical harm, reduced personal safety and autonomy.
And then you would go in front of a judge, and usually it's just you the first time, and then the judge, if granted, the police department will send a service of that, and they'll be back in 10 days for a 2-party hearing to see if that is going to be extended for up to a year. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So Hunter, as DA Paul Tucker mentioned, it takes a while for new laws to settle into the system, as it were. But from your perspective, how does this new framework change the way domestic violence cases are approached in the courtroom and by law enforcement?
So again, I just want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to talk about such a serious issue that a lot of people deal with in our community. What I will say is I sit in court every day as a part of my job. I'm a district court ADA, so what that means is I'll be assigned to a particular session and I'll be sitting in that session. And a lot of things that we hear, a lot of hearings that we hear are restraining order hearings. So those will be mixed into all of the criminal hearings. And I can tell you that I have seen a lot of the judges, at least in the Salem District Court, take this new coercive control into account when they're deciding on 209A orders. I can speak to HAWC, working with people who are trying to get these 209A orders. I've seen people who have HAWC assistants explain coercive control actually to a judge, and the judge was very impressed with the way that they were able to sort of state what the law is, and I'm sure that's in big part to HAWC and informing them on how they could qualify for one of those orders. But I've seen several judges since this law has taken effect cite various different things that would qualify under coercive control. So, for example, I've seen people talk about someone tracking where they're going, not allowing them, again, to be with their friends, controlling who they're hanging out with, controlling what they do, and just monitoring them. And so the judge cited the new coercive control law when he did issue the order. And so I do think that it's having a big impact on 209A orders and who's actually able to obtain those. I think it's a lot, it makes sense because a lot of these behaviors will escalate to physical violence, and it's a little bit more of a proactive way for someone to get that protection before it escalates even further.
And it's good to have, even before it escalates to violence and maybe becomes criminal, it's good to have even have something in writing or in record as well.
Right, and obviously if someone obtains an abuse prevention order, it becomes then a criminal violation if someone were to violate that order. I can tell you that I've seen people sometimes request not a no contact order, but just a no abuse order if they still want to have contact with the person who they're obtaining the order against. And this new definition of abuse would change the analysis of whether or not that order was violated. So in the past, a judge may have looked at abuse differently. Obviously, it was defined differently, and we heard what that new definition is today. And so something that we know is domestic violence, that we know is coercive today, a judge would be able to consider in terms of determining whether someone violated that order. So I think it would have an impact in that way as well.
And again, maybe to take a step back, because I just don't want to assume where folks' knowledge is at on these, is a restraining order, 209A restraining order, is a civil order, right? And so it's not something, and I hear this all the time of like, this person, my partner, is doing this to me, but there's no evidence. And I have to explain, like, there is evidence. You're the evidence. Your testimony is taken into account and is evidence. But it's an interesting legal tool because, as you'd mentioned, a violation of a restraining order, even though it starts civil, becomes criminal?
Yes, so exactly. So the order itself is civil, but any sort of violation would be a criminal offense, and someone could report that to the police, and a person could be charged with a criminal offense at that point. And so it gives, that's kind of the teeth, I would say, to the abuse prevention order, is it gives someone a reason to abide by that order. If they need something more than it's a court order, they should listen to it. The fact that they could potentially get arrested if they violate it, I think, is an additional sort of piece of encouragement not to violate it.
Thank you. One of the challenges with coercive control is it often remains hidden from public view. What advice do the both of you have for individuals who may be in abusive relationships but don't recognize the manipulation and control they're experiencing? How can friends, family, and community members best support those who might be dealing with these more subtle forms of abuse?
So I think I'm gonna take that in pieces. I think this legislation is a really important opportunity. We're here tonight, right? You know, what we have been talking about for years, that abuse includes all these different types of tactics and behaviors, not just physical abuse. Now we're here, we're talking about it. Hopefully that will become more and more understood throughout our community and our cultures. I think a really important thing that we hear from people who have experienced abuse and come to HAWC for help is questioning whether what they're experiencing is abuse or not. And I think this education it applies to everyone that's experiencing these tactics, and invalidating. Sometimes people say, you know, but they don't hit me. You know, I don't understand why, I don't understand why this is so hard. But this, learning about the span of what can constitute abuse, I think is validating for what people are experiencing.
And I think something we heard from Jen too when she gave her opening remarks is trust your gut. If it doesn't feel right, it's probably not. So that's something I would say is if you're feeling like something isn't right, trust your gut.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And she talked about becoming smaller. Jen, you shared that also beautifully. We often teach people that to think about whether your world is getting bigger or smaller. Does this person isolate you or help you connect with others? And that's often one of the most primary indicators of whether this person is attempting to control you. And that's what we'll talk more about, I'm sure, but all of these behaviors are aimed at controlling someone's partner. We can talk about like some of these behaviors in of themselves might not be as abusive, but when the purpose is to control another person, that's where we see a risk of harm.
Yeah. Anything else?
And I would just say that something that I see a lot in the cases that I work with and the people that we get to meet and we get to speak with is a lot of times this coercive control, these behaviors of belittling someone, isolating someone, taking them away from their friends and family, preventing them from doing things that they might enjoy doing. It very frequently does escalate to physical violence. And so if someone's able to sort of understand that what they're going through is not okay before it gets to that point, I think that's really important as well.
Yeah, and I think your awareness, or you're bringing attention to the fact that oftentimes, even though it starts at coercive control, and maybe it does stay there, maybe it never becomes physical, as we sometimes see that it often does become physical. And that actually brings me, Sarah, to something that you were mentioning of this idea of control in relationships. Is there anything you wanted to expand on that at all?
Yeah. So I know when this law came out, you see this whole list of behaviors that can constitute coercive control. And I'm sure a lot of people look at it and say, oh gosh, like, is that my relationship? And I think it's important to remember that we're looking at, is this behavior aimed at controlling someone? And I'll use, I think the technology pieces of coercive control are really good examples. I'm of an age where I have a teenager and we use Life 360 on his cell phone to keep track of him. And there's been a really lively discussion between friends and family. Oh, do the adults automatically participate in Life 360? And how does that feel? And do I feel tracked by my partner? Or like, do we have less sense of trust if we need to know where each other are all the time? And whatever the decision is, whatever the outcome of that conversation, doesn't necessarily mean it's controlling or abusive, but it's the conversation that you have about that decision. Mm-hmm. So if it is a conversation with mutual respect and accepting your partner's ideas and beliefs and having a back and forth between two equals, that is a healthy relationship. So I think that's what we're looking for in distinguishing healthy and unhealthy behaviors.
That control piece
Yeah.
is really important. I could keep talking to you two for forever, but I think that this might be a good time to transfer and see if anybody from the audience, who we can't see you all at all, but has any questions.
Ooh, that helps. Thank you.
Thank you.
I see one. And I'm not surprised who it is.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, if someone is denied a restraining order, is there a way to appeal it? Or if they give a dual restraining order, does the survivor have any recourse to go beyond the court?
Yep, so nothing has changed in a plaintiff's ability to appeal a 209A order, so you have to object on the record, and you have a certain time frame to appeal that decision. Nothing has changed there. What we do know that appeals are challenging, and that's where it's really great when we can get pro bono attorneys involved to support people in those kind of appeals, because it is an important aspect of how we make sure the law is working and hold judges accountable to enforcing the laws appropriately. There is also the opportunity to seek another 209A at a later time if there's different, additional facts. We have seen some cases where someone applied for a harassment prevention order initially, a 258E, and because of the new law, we're able to convert that to a 209A. So we have seen some of those kind of procedural instances.
And I've also seen a lot of judges say, if you have anything else, please do come back. Again, there's nothing barring someone from coming back. Also, maybe if you had text messages to support what you were trying to tell the judge, or if you have photographs and you want to come back with additional information, I think that's always helpful too. But there's nothing barring someone from going back and trying again.
Thank you.
Maybe while people are thinking, I want to give a shout out to the advocates and the coalitions that fought hard for this law. The Family Advocacy Coalition, TRAC, Jane Doe Inc., all of the survivors who told their stories. This was a tremendous push that happened kind of almost from outside the system to make the law reflect people's real experiences. And that's amazing. That kind of community action is really incredible. So I want to give a shout out to all of them.
Thank you. Any other, looks like we have one.
Hi, I'm going to put myself out there. I have a lot of questions that I'm not going to inundate the audience with. I am interested. I've made a lot of, tried to make connections, trying to get people to understand what I experience, and sometimes I'm validated, sometimes I'm not. I just need someone to connect to after this, to try to get pointed in some directions. Okay. I don't know how, do I just meet somebody over there at the Endicott table, or how do we kind of connect?
Come find me in front of the stage, okay?
Okay, thank you.
And I also just want to say, working in the district court, sometimes we as prosecutors and also as victim witness advocates need a little bit more help. There's a lot of things that we can't do for people. There's resources that we don't have, and HAWC being in the courthouses makes a huge difference. We send so many people to HAWC. They get so many resources and ideas of where to go next from HAWC. So I would always recommend anyone going to see HAWC if you're looking for some resources, and I'm very thankful for HAWC being in the courthouses as well.
Thank you, and right back at you. We're so lucky, our district attorney's office being so responsive. And I think one thing we try to do is help people understand the system that they're operating in. So you have law enforcement that might, is initially arresting and charging with a crime. Then if there is a charge of a crime, then it goes to the DA's office for prosecution, and that is a case to hold that defendant accountable. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts is holding them accountable for breaking the law. And then you have HAWC is on the side, and our responsibility and duty is directly to the victim, the survivor, and we are able to work towards what that person's goals are. And so there's kind of a continuum of organizations and people set up to support someone who has experienced abuse, and we have different functions. And it can get really confusing, and that's where at HAWC we really try to help people understand, okay, this is what you can expect in criminal court, this is what you can do in civil court, here's how you might handle your case in probate court.
And I think you actually just said something really important that I try to say to survivors that I'm speaking to, is that a lot of times they'll feel very bad for going to the police. They won't want to do anything to harm their former partner or their current partner. And I always say that it's our job to make sure that justice is served. It's our job to make sure that we're holding people accountable for their actions, and it's not a victim or it's not a survivor who's the one who's carrying that weight. It's our job. It's not a survivor's job. And so I always try to tell people it's not you that's doing anything. It's the Commonwealth. It's the prosecutor. So
Yeah, and I always try to, because I kind of stand somewhere in between, HAWC and the DA's office. I do a little bit of what HAWC does, but then I do a little bit of the victim witness advocacy work of what the DA's office does as well. But I follow up with any domestic police report, any domestic call. I follow up with the victim of those cases, and a lot of times going in between referring to HAWC or calling HAWC for assistance or working with the DA's office on the case. And one of the things I always like to tell folks too, because I get that a lot, of like, I didn't want to go to the police, or I don't want this person to get in trouble, is another way to think about it is like, this is a good chance for this person to get help too, right? So there's another way I try to help folks reframe that thinking. So.
And that's a good thing to talk about too. A lot of times, cases that we're dealing with, we're trying to get defendants into programs. There's an intimate partners program that a lot of people do as part of a disposition on a case involving domestic violence, and that kind of goes through. It's almost like a therapy type of program where they have to talk about, why they did what they did, kind of learn some coping mechanisms. So that's also a good outcome that could occur in one of these cases.
Any other questions? All right, so, couple here. We'll get you next in the front. Oh, great. You did see her.
Hi, thank you guys so much for all of the work that you do. It's super incredibly needed. I wanted to say that I'm sure that this work is shaping not only these kinds of relationships, but also relationships amongst colleagues, and even, I'm sure, in the police department, relationships amongst each other. And just wanted to kind of like think out loud here and ask if any of you have any resources or know of any any resources that could help in terms of learning what constitutes a healthy relationship earlier on, so for our kids, because this work is incredibly powerful and needed, and also just wondering how can we, take care of the kids that are super young and impressionable, and kind of just embed these healthy dynamics in relationships.
We have some great community partners that do some youth education work. I think I saw our friends for the YWCA here. They do some work in schools. There's some great national websites. Love is Respect, focused on teens. There's a statewide campaign called Respectfully, that is geared to a very wide range of young people, very appropriate even for our youngest children, to learn what makes you feel bad, what makes you feel good when you're talking to a friend. There's a great opportunity coming up on February 26th, I believe, which is a Healthy Youth Summit that's going to be held in Boston. The Governor's Council on Domestic and Sexual Violence is inviting young people to come learn about healthy relationships, and it's going to be a great opportunity for particularly, middle school, high schoolers, to come learn and help be advocates for bringing this information back to their schools.
I'll say locally, I'm not so new in the job anymore, but I'm not quite a year into being the domestic violence advocate here, but I've begun a domestic violence community group, and we meet monthly. Find me after, and I can get your email or whatever, put you on the list if you want. And one of the main focuses of that group is definitely going to be prevention for the community. So it's definitely something I'm passionate about from my career. So.
you're going to have to drag me off the stage without mentioning this. So this was expanding the definition of abuse was an important part of this legislation. You heard DA Tucker talk about the extension of the statute of limitations for assault and battery on a family or household member as another part of this legislation. There was also really important firearms, gun safety legislation that expanded the ways we can use extreme risk protection orders. Those are commonly known as the red flag laws. And that is a tool to increase safety that is really underused in the Commonwealth. This law has been on the book for over 5 years, I believe, and is very, very seldom used. An extreme risk protection order is a civil order, just like an abuse prevention order, a restraining order, or a harassment prevention order. And it allows someone to seek the removal of firearms. There's some pros and cons when you might seek a restraining order versus using the extreme risk protection order. But what's really valuable about the extreme risk protection order is that other people can file it. So we've seen some really sad cases here in Essex County where people knew an individual was experiencing extreme mental health crisis, and medical teams knew it. They knew that this person posed a risk of harm to other people and themselves. And now, with the expansion of this law for ERPOs, a health official or a school official can file one of these ERPOs, extreme risk protection orders, to have firearms removed. This is a great alternative for someone who's experiencing domestic violence, where it might be too dangerous for them to file for a restraining order. They know that it might instigate a greater risk of harm or other behavior from their partner. But a school official, a health professional could file one of these orders and have firearms removed from the house, which really reduces the risk of homicide, suicide, and other extreme harm. So our team is, present in court and can help you understand more of the nuance when to seek one or the other. HAWC services are completely confidential, and we can work with someone to minimize to the greatest extent possible that their partner might find out. We can help you get a phone or a laptop that doesn't have, and they haven't had the opportunity to get on or track or do anything like that with. We can provide services virtually or in person. We can set up safety words and all kinds of safety planning measures to minimize to the greatest extent possible that this other person finds out what you're doing. Trust your instincts as to what your partner may or may not do, and trust your instincts when it's time to take steps, however fast or however slow. And there are people, whether Ross at the police station, if you want to, seek the support of police, the DA's office, or an organization like HAWC, friends or family, people are ready to help you when you're ready.
One of the great things about Beverly funding this position is that I mentioned up front that I'm not a police officer, and one of the great things about that is that I don't have to press charges, so I can have a level of confidentiality like HAWC. So HAWC's a great resource, and I would definitely start conversations there. But if you need some other conversations, I'm also available as well, and don't need to. I don't need to let anybody know about any conversations. So.
And I would also say, whenever you do feel comfortable, if you are in fear for your safety, please don't hesitate to go to the police. I know that you might be concerned about doing that if your partner may find out about that, and I think that HAWC is a really good place to start. But we want to help you as well. And I always say, if you're concerned about your safety, please do go to the police, because they will remove, and especially if you're in concern of your immediate safety, if you're concerned that something might happen soon, the police will go there, the police will take that person away. And so for that moment, he will not, or she will not be there. And you can take it one step at a time at that point. But I do think it's important sometimes in certain situations, and I agree with Sarah, you know your situation best, that you make sure that you're safe and that that person may be removed from the household so that you're not in fear of your safety.
Yeah, the police, the officers that I work with are dedicated and passionate, a group of folks who generally do a great job at listening and trying to make sure people are safe, and they're concerned about their safety when that's appropriate.
Ross, you had asked earlier, we kind of talked about what to, asking, for the person who might be experiencing abusive tactics. And you started to ask about what can friends and family do. Also, one of my very favorite questions to be asked, the most important thing you can do is to withhold judgment. Anyone who's experienced abuse will often say the worst feeling is feeling ashamed, that they knew better. People told them not to be in a relationship with a person, and that makes it even harder to ask for help. So withholding judgment, and then don't be in a rush to take control. It's a very natural thing when you see someone that you love or care about being hurt. You say, "Oh my God, you got to do this." Okay, I know what we should do. Here we go, and that's taking control away from that person. Your job as the supportive family member, friend, coworker, employer, community advocate, your job is to return control to the person who's experienced abuse. Your job is to support and say, okay, what do you want to do? Okay, I'm going to help you do that. And that's hard. That is harder than anyone can really imagine. But respecting that person's decision, even if they tell you they don't need help, even if they're not telling you everything, they need help, they know that something isn't right, they will tell you when they're ready. So it's really important to just provide support rather than trying to say, okay, we got to do this.
And what I would like to add too is, even if you're not a friend or a family member, but I've seen a few situations where someone sees something happening on the street, or they'll hear something happening in their apartment complex, and they will call the police. The police will arrive and they'll respond to what could have been a really bad situation, but someone took it upon themselves to act and to try and prevent something bad from happening. And I've seen a lot of people who have been strangers, essentially, prevent something that could have been really bad from happening. So even if you're not related in any way to the person, if you hear something happening or if you see something happening, please don't hesitate to reach out to the police, because honestly, you really could save someone's life. And I think we've seen that a few times in the DA's office.
Was there another question, or is...
He got his answer.
Oh, he got his
Yes.
answer. Okay. Yeah, I think Senator Lovely has a question.
Thank you. So how would you advise someone who comes to you who is not prepared to leave the relationship because they're so financially bound? We see that all the time. What's the advice to that person?
It's tough. This is where you can't sugarcoat it. Money is money, and you need it in order to live independently from that person. So I think there's, it depends on the situation, how dangerous it is, whether we need to make a plan to flee and, create physical safety first and then work on, obtaining, an income or benefits. And sometimes it's more of a slower process of getting your ducks in a row. Okay, how can I possibly will my partner let me secure employment? Okay, that's a start. Okay, I need to get my kids in daycare or after school care. We can work on pieces that can start to create the opportunity for some sort of financial independence. The divorce process that can take time, but you can secure a divorce or your custody process. You can, secure custody and child support. Those things take time. There's ways to do it faster. And it takes a lot of fortitude. And that's why, we're in awe of people that have to do that hard work every single day. Because there's no magic wands to making it happen. But when there is extreme danger, and then we trust the survivor in their assessment of that, we can make one thing or another happen first, and then we just work on the pieces that follow. But this is why, I think on a regional and state level, we support things like the Common Start Bill, affordable, high-quality childcare that will empower parents in general, but especially mothers, to have childcare so they can work. Right now, the realities of the cost of living and childcare can make it really, really challenging under the best of circumstances. So that legislation is really, really important.
I would add to that too, that depending on the situation, that a plaintiff or a victim who goes for a restraining order can also ask the court I was working on a case recently where the defendant in the restraining order was the primary breadwinner, and the court ordered him to continue to pay what he was, essentially the bills that he was paying for the family, even though he was told not to be around the plaintiff for the year. Yeah, so there's also some legal means for that as well.
And oftentimes when it comes to us and we're worried about people staying away from the defendant, staying away from the victim or from the survivor, we have conversations with people who are concerned about, well, where am I going to go? I live with the defendant. Where am I supposed to move to? How do I survive without him or her? What I can say is I have seen judges, and really judges should be doing this, say that to the defendant, you need to find another place to stay. I've seen that happen numerous times. I've seen judges on occasion say, I'm going to give you, so for example, if someone isn't on the lease, if the victim is not on the lease, I've seen judges say, okay, I'm going to give you some time. How much time do you need to look for a new place to stay? And so the victim will have some time, sometimes not enough. I understand it's very difficult, but we'll have some sort of like a period where they can look for other living arrangements. But I have seen numerous judges say to defendants, you cannot go back here. So in terms of housing, at least, I've seen that addressed a few times in court.
And I'm really proud to share that HAWC has secured federal funding, HUD funding, to start a rapid rehousing program. Someone who will be able to provide rental assistance for up to 12 months, a portion of their rent to help people get stabilized. A shout out to my rapid rehousing team here. That's, another way that we're trying to address the very real challenge of moving on from an abusive relationship where you're suddenly go from one income to zero or two incomes to one.
Any other questions? One other one back here. I also don't know. I don't have my phone on me, so I have no idea what time it is. I haven't been told.
Someone tell us if it's time to go home.
Yes, time.
Hi, my name's Tracy, and thank you so much. I don't really know if I particularly have a question, but my son's 14, and 14 years ago, a HAWC advocate helped me walk into the Salem District Court and secure a restraining order that I was so fearful of getting way back then. I was deathly afraid of my son's father, and I was kind of in the same spot that this woman just shared. Had the courage enough to speak up. I never would have been able to do that way back then. I was always looking over my shoulder and always afraid. I was always afraid to go to the police. I never ever thought that anybody could get me out of it. I thought I deserved it. I thought everything that was happening to me at that time was my fault because I was so small at that time. And I never thought I was ever gonna be in the place that I'm in today. 14 years later, I can tell you that my life is completely different. And I remember being 3 months pregnant with my son and being placed in a HAWC, or like a domestic violence shelter in Worcester, and finding a way to get in touch with him to get me out of there, because I didn't think I was ever going to be able to, because that is isolating in itself, right? Being taken from Beverly, Massachusetts, and going to Worcester and being like, how am I ever going to survive out here? And I can tell you that I am definitely a survivor today. Like, I don't look at myself as a victim. I'm so grateful for every single bad thing that has ever happened in my journey that has made me who I am today. And I remember when I got that restraining order and the terrible feelings that I felt in the court, and feeling like just like nobody was ever gonna, nobody listened to me. Nobody ever, like, I remember leaving the courthouse and I had slashed tires. He had slashed my tires, and not knowing how I was gonna get to work the next day. Things that, like, because I was so financially broken when I left. And I know there's so many things that I never thought I was ever going to see the other side of. And it was so hard. It was so hard. I went to a shelter when he was 2 months old. And a year later, like, I got my first apartment, and he would stalk me. He would ring my doorbell at 2 o'clock in the morning. I remember being afraid to call the police. I remember calling Beverly PD before I got the restraining order, and they wouldn't come because I didn't have a restraining order, and just begging them on the phone going, I'm afraid of him. He won't drop my son off. Like, please come so I can make the transfer with you guys here. And they wouldn't come. And I remember the officer came the next day and said, I told them if they hear his name come over, the radio again, they're to, like, come here. I know him. He's not a good individual. And I just know that things have changed so much over time. And I'm so glad you're here, like, to hear that you're doing prevention, and my son is in the middle school, and to hear these signs and the coercive control, like, that is amazing. Like, it's come so far, and, because you guys have been just chugging along and doing all the work, and I'm really just grateful to be part of this process, and to say, like, it does work, because, 14 years later, I'm not in an abusive relationship. I'm in a good relationship with a wonderful person that doesn't tell me I'm a piece of dirt every day and make me feel like I'm an inch small. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? Like, things do change, and I'm just here to applaud you guys and just say, I'm glad that you guys are doing the work that you do. In that journey, I got sober. I'm in recovery. I work out of the police department myself in Stoneham, and I have some amazing people that I work with, and we came tonight just to be part of this, just to see if we could do it in our community in Stoneham. And and I just, this was my passion. I was gonna, back 5-6 years ago, I was gonna get into advocacy and do some DV work, but my life took me into another direction around substance use and social services. So I'm here tonight just kind of, just wanted to applaud you guys and just say great job, and thank you to Senator Lovely over there, and I appreciate all of the hard work that you guys do. Thank you.
Oh, well,
Thank you.
Tracy, we all want to say thank you to you. Thank you for sharing your story and giving all of us hope. That is a beautiful, beautiful story about your journey. We're so appreciative of that. And I think I was talking to Michael from the DA's office. It's so nice to come together to talk about improvements. I know so many of us spend our days in our lives really addressing gaps in our safety nets and challenges, the bad things that people do to each other. It's really nice to come together tonight around progress that's being made, and I hope that's what people take with them tonight. There is a way to keep making things better. We can educate our young people, make sure our 14-year-olds that first relationship is a positive one. And when the second or the third one isn't, maybe they'll have something to fall back on, that they'll know the signs this isn't a good relationship. There's so many ways to get involved. HAWC will be starting a new policy advocacy committee. If hearing about laws and creating new laws gets you excited, that's one way you can get involved. We have some great court volunteers here, and they can tell you about the experience of helping people one-on-one in court. It's frequently the hardest day of someone's life, and more than anything, we here just to have someone by their side. Doesn't matter that it wasn't an attorney or they didn't know the law inside and out. Just having someone by their side made all the difference in the world and gave them the courage to do what they needed that day. So get involved. There's hope. Things can change, and we can all be a part of it.
Thank you. I actually think that is your story is a perfect bookend to the event. So we started with and ended with a survivor story. So I want to thank the panelists, Sarah and Hunter. Not only was it a joy to have a conversation with you today, but it's a joy to continue to work with you in this field and to make that progress and give that hope. So thank you very much for joining me tonight. And thank you all.